Ultraman Tiga was the first Ultraman series that captivated me as a child. The memories of watching the same CDs of giant titans fighting giant monsters was a spectacle. The design of Tiga was also simple. The attack team had uniforms that were unique. The show had episodic stories that were engaging, but most importantly, the soundtrack was memorable. In one of my previous videos, I talked about the soundtrack of Garv, mentioning Go Sakabe being a talented artist and enjoying the work that he had put into making the soundtracks for the TV shows, most notably for Garv and 01. Now, I would like to do the same for this video, but for Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia, as the trilogy offers a soundtrack that is iconic to the Ultraman franchise. Any moment you would listen to either of the three soundtracks, you would reminisce of the memories that you would have for when the soundtrack would appear in the shows. Something about the emotions of Tiga, the slow rhythm of violins, the feelings from the piano, or the intensity of the battle sequence, the hopefulness of Dyna, the thumping of the drums, the catchy fighting song, or the times of mysteriousness, and the heroicness of Gaia, the sounds of the horns, the loudness of the trumpets, the fantasy of the story. But there is one thing that I want to do differently this time with this video. Rather than talk about the soundtrack and the composer, I want to talk about the usage of the soundtrack and analyze from my understanding how much the soundtracks play a role in affecting the story and the narrative, and to understand why the Ultraman Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia soundtracks are iconic. Now, there are some things to understand before I begin my analysis of Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia. The first thing to mention is the critical theories of film analysis, specifically for soundtracks. There are theories called neoformalism, narratology, semiotics, Copland's functions, and many, many more. I would like to mention these because they serve as an understanding for how music and the soundtracks work into the shows or movies, as some theories talk about how the usage of music and film techniques can create an impact on the viewer, such as a happy soundtrack for a comedic scene, which would give the viewer an understanding that the scene is comedic, or it could be a sad, slower pacing of music for a sad scene, which could make the viewer understand that the scene is sad. These theories have started from the days of when the first films began, with talks about the montages of films that make a scene, then to synchronization between the sound and the video, to then mimicry of sounds, and then musical soundtracks that complement the scenes of movies. In other words, music and soundtracks for TV shows and movies play a part in formalizing an emotion that can sway the interest of the viewer, which isn't limited to just telling the story visually, but also through dialogue and music. The second thing to mention is some of the terms to know about. Diegetic sound is the sound that can be heard by the characters. Non-diegetic is sound that can't be heard by the characters and can be heard by the audience. Mimetic sound is the replication of real sounds. Synchronized sound is sound that is timed precisely with the image. Asynchronized sound is sound that isn't timed with the image. Now, there are more terms that are used for the study of soundtracks, but for the purpose of this video, I want to keep it straight to the point, and also without dragging this video out for too long. I will also only talk about one specific episode for each show, and analyze the episode for how the soundtracks, which include music and sound or film techniques, can impact the emotions of the episode. So without diving too deep into explaining the many terms or introducing too much about the vast amount of critical theories for film, I will introduce the ideas during the discussion of the episodes of the shows, and to show my understanding for how music and sound techniques play a part in creating narratives and emotions in the story. So we begin with in episode 50, titled Take Me Higher, the opening begins with a dream sequence of Daigo, the main character, experiencing a sort of reality where there was a disastrous outcome for all of humanity. The soundtrack that is used involves a lot of mimetic synchronization, where sounds of destruction is replicated from real sounds and is timed with the events of what is occurring on screen. However, when Rena, a love interest character, walks in, the soundtrack stops suddenly until a low creeping soundtrack continues, and then a deathly silent scene takes place where no sound occurs. Already at this introducing scene, there is a lot of symbolism being portrayed, how a continuity of the soundtrack is played over a montage of scenes, and the replicated sounds of crumbling buildings and burning fire are used to emphasize the symbolism of destruction and the continuity between the dream sequence and the reality. This continuity is broken up into two parts, one where it is visually showing us Daigo's dream, and the other after Daigo wakes up, as the musical soundtrack is different between the two sequences, so it feels to be two different montages. However, one thing that is interesting that is continued from the dream sequence to Daigo waking up is the sound effect of fire. This was still played after Daigo wakes up, which gives a feeling that Daigo was still in the midst of the dream, as the sound effect creates a continuity of the two scenes, linking the dream to the reality. However, after Rena enters, the music changes with the sudden sound effects, and then eventually falls silent. With the lighting and camera angles, it depicted a metaphor of Rena being the one that could ease the experience that Daigo was undertaking, and the bright lighting of her entering reflects the idea that she came to ease Daigo's troubles. But it ends quickly, as there is a montage between Daigo and Rena. With the silence between the two, Rena is then shown to be facing something that was sorrow, as the lighting changes from bright as she walks in to dark, showing only half her face in the darkness. As the scenes go back and forth, Daigo is depicted to be shown in a dimly lit room of red and yellow, reflecting on the colors of his visions that he was currently seeing. The meaning behind this scene could be depicting Daigo to not only see the visions within himself, but the emotions that indirectly come from his visions can also be seen and felt externally. While Rena being depicted in a dark setting could mean that she feels the emotions that Daigo was indirectly emitting. As this montage takes place, the scene is depicted in total silence. Usually for montages without dialogue, there would be music in the background that is added to elevate the setting and the narrative. However, the completely silent scene with no background track, including diegetic sounds such as the sounds of computers, isn't heard in the scene, which later in the episode, when Daigo walks into his room, there was still background noise to fill the silence, even though he was in the room by himself. But in the opening scene, the completely silent setting felt ominous. Even though there was feelings and emotions being depicted visually, the scene not having any musical noise gave it a perspective that this situation was different than any other silent scenes. Emotions were there, the silence was felt, and the experiences that were taking place between the two characters with Daigo and Rena was understandable. Rena felt the emotions from Daigo, as Daigo was undergoing a process of ominousity, which is reflected from how the camera angles and the lighting is shown, using the dark setting and the lack of background noises that brings out the feeling of ominousity and awareness that the two characters were facing. Later on in the episode, during a battle with a monster, another visual and musical scene takes place as Daigo and Rena are in the Maxima Overdrive powered Gutswing jet chasing the monster into outer space. Dialogue takes place between the two as Rena questions Daigo about why he must take on the burden by himself, alluding to the fact that Rena was aware that Daigo is Ultraman Tiga. The scene felt like a burden was being lifted as Daigo, without showing to Rena, reveals his identity for the first time in front of anyone, that he was in fact Ultraman all this time. During this scene, the opening theme song of Tiga begins to play, with the lyrics "Take Me Higher" reflecting on the scene, where it gets timed with the moment Rena and Daigo reach a point above the clouds. The alluding idea that this is the moment that Rena had been waiting for during the entirety of the show, wanting Daigo to show his other self to her and to elevate her to another level, and where it's not only Daigo that is lifting her up, but also Ultraman Tiga as well. The scene depicts this moment really well. The timing of the music fading into the scene gave it the upbeat hype that leads to the climax of the character development between Daigo and Rena, and the coincidence of the lyrics of the opening theme song reinforced the idea that Daigo being Tiga would be the one thing to bring Rena to levels that no other character would possibly go. After the battles with Tiga and the monster, we are then in a montage where Daigo and Rena are in a grass field. The same opening theme song is played again, but this time in a cover that is more saddening and emotional. This could be a parallelism of the scene where Daigo and Rena were breaking boundaries that were never broken. With the scene in the grass field, the cover of the theme song gave the montage of the two a saddening feeling, yet what was depicted visually felt different. The moment between the two felt to be more hopeful, that the fact that Daigo had revealed his identity to Rena for the first time, which could mean that the saddening theme song could be felt as a more emotional reflection of the previous scene, as previously the upbeat theme song that played when Daigo and Rena were on the jet reflected on the emotions of the build-up of Rena wanting to see Daigo become his other self, and the hype that it brings, as it was the first time Daigo had revealed it to anyone. But the saddening version could be a reflection on the previous moment, as Rena's emotions were limited because she couldn't show her emotions directly to Daigo as she was facing away from him at the time. But as they were on the grass field, Daigo and Rena could see each other, and therefore could express the feelings and the emotions while facing each other. However, not much dialogue was said between the two characters, which could be another reflection on how emotions could be felt between the two characters, as mentioned for the opening scenes in the episode. And for them to express emotions again meant that there was an understanding between the two characters, that they are characters that have a bond that is unbreakable, that the understanding for each other reached levels that go beyond the other characters, or the expression that they are love interests, and that the love they show didn't require them to speak a word, as they both could understand each other's emotions and pain without the need to express their feelings through dialogue. The replaying of the theme song in a saddening tone could then reflect on the idea that the two could finally express the same thoughts that were previously felt, as the visual depictions having parallelisms of narratives from the first scene that was used to the next gave the final scene a more hopeful feeling rather than a saddening feeling, and the idea of the soundtrack then reflecting onto the visuals gave it a feeling of peace and love for the two characters, as the music from the original upbeat song to the saddening version expressed the thoughts but had different emotions during the moment. The music truly brings out the depth of the characters' understanding for each other. It's a clever way to express similar ideas through incorporating the theme song and its similar melodies to the show. In episode 4 of Ultraman Dyna, titled Battle Underground City, it uses techniques that differ from episode 50 of Ultraman Tiga. One of the techniques is the usage of asynchronous sound, where there are character dialogues that talk outside of the visual screen. Although it may not seem to be something that is too extravagant, without this usage of asynchronous sound technique, the scenes would have been continuously changing every time each character speaks, meaning that if the scene of the team members gathering together to discuss the issue of the monster appearance were to diegetically show who is talking visually, the scene would have been continuously going back and forth, visually showing each character that is speaking to show to the audience that the person is talking. So with the usage of asynchronous sound, it gives the feeling that there are people that were outside of the visual frame of the scene. It could also be the reason for having most of the characters be visually seen in these scenes, so that it could reduce the amount of montages needed to go back and forth between characters. This technique is also used for another scene during a press conference meeting, in where it introduces the viewer to the organization who was responsible for causing disruptions. There is a visual image that shows us a video of what the organization is and what they are doing. However, in the dialogue, we don't see who is speaking and can assume that it was coming from the video itself, but afterwards, the same voice is then shown visually synchronized with the person who was introducing the organization. Again, although it feels like something that seems insignificant, the technique of using asynchronous sound, then switching back to synchronous sound, gives it a feeling that there was a larger cast that wasn't being shown in the scene. It's the same again for the next scene, where it is focused on two people talking, where a woman tells the president of the company to tend to an emergency matter. The same feeling again, that there is an asynchronous and synchronous sound technique that was used in one scene to show that there was a larger cast that was behind what was being visually shown. However, in this situation, the synchronous sound was used at the same time as the asynchronous. As the previous moments, the synchronous and the asynchronous sound was used in a montage that happened in one scene using synchronous and then the next scene using asynchronous. So with this scene using both, the focalization is on the two characters, giving us a feeling that the dialogue being synchronously shown visually will place the characters as the important characters that set them apart from the background, and that with this focus, it means that the story is now revolved around these characters, and that attention should be brought upon on these characters that are diegetically shown. Later in the episode, after the monster attacks, and Asuka, the main character who becomes Ultraman Dyna, is stuck underground in the building with the president and the woman. After the dramatic musical soundtracks that played to emphasize the damage and the power the monster had emitted, we are then put in a scene that brings about character. The musical soundtrack was stopped during the scene and was replaced by diegetic sounds of minor crumblings of the building and natural background noises of the diegetic scene. The usage of only using background noises and not a soundtrack gave it a depiction of people being themselves in moments that could be their final. It also brings out the bonding of the characters, as the diegetic dialogue discusses the purpose and the feelings that each of the characters had, and in moments of terror makes them reflect on who they are as a character, especially with Asuka, who throughout the interaction between him and the president, he was talking like a normal person, or a friend to anyone in any social situation. Although the scene may not visually depict him in an ideal situation, the dialogue without a musical backing track gives it a moment of reflection, and it brings out what makes Asuka be Asuka, someone who seemed to be hopeful in any situation, the personality of being lighthearted in any situation, but also a sense of understanding and importance that he plays in interacting with characters in any given situation. All of this done without the need of a musical soundtrack to try and emphasize the importance of the scene. If there were to have a musical soundtrack, the elements of having a thought-provoking character moment would be overshadowed by the soundtrack trying to hyperbolize what was felt to be down to earth. So without the need of a soundtrack in these scenes, it would have made the scene feel relatable, as the music would saturate it with exaggerations of the situation. However, in the final scene of the show, where Asuka and the president reflect on the damage that was caused by the monster, having the musical soundtrack in this moment felt like it was the right decision, as it made the previous interaction between the two feel justified, that the need to express their thoughts made them characters who saw eye to eye, and the music reflects on their success of being able to see each other as people who shared an understanding of friendship for each other, especially after the pain and destruction that they had been through. The justification of the soundtrack made it a wholesome moment of friendship. But otherwise, in many of the other moments, the musical soundtrack brings out the dramaticness of each moment, with the monster attacking, Super Guts making their move and taking down the monster, and also the appearance of Dyna and his newly debut of his strong type. The usage of the fighting song in the scene gave it an iconic feeling, as the battle theme saying Dyna gives it a feeling that the crowd of people were cheering Dyna on and fighting the monster, and his strong type form gives it a feeling of heroic strength as it's synchronized with Dyna tossing the monster around like a rag doll. The music in this episode did elevate the scenes, but I felt that the moments that used other techniques had emphasized a more character-based development. Although the episode had many catchy beats, they worked in a way that complemented each moment that happened. But when the music stops and the characters begin to show who they are, I felt those moments left a stronger impression on me, as I was able to understand the emotions and the feelings that the characters had for each other, which is impressive. I felt like the people behind the works of this episode were aware of when to use the music and when not to, as the timing for when the music kicks in gave the episode so much emphasis. But when the moments came to bring about the idea of character growth, it worked with when the music stopped. But otherwise, the beat and the rhythm of the musical soundtracks was fantastic. In episode 26, titled The Final Resolution, similar techniques and ideas were used in where synchronous sounds were diegetically seen, where the scene would be by the ocean, and the natural sound of the oceans are heard with diegetically synchronized dialogue being paired. Also in other scenes, there was the usage of a musical soundtrack that is used to emphasize the dramatic moments of each scene, and also the usage of mimetic synchronization, similar to all tokusatsu shows, that replicates the noises that would not naturally be recorded on set, such as the grunts of Gaia and Agul, or the sound effects of the beam clashes and the opening of the wormhole. However, later in the episode, there is a moment that brings out the importance of the character growth of Gamu and Fujimiya, or Ultraman Gaia and Agul, where the musical soundtrack provides a sense of parallelism and elevation in the story that emphasizes the moment that the viewer had been waiting for. But to give a quick summary of the episode, spoilers ahead, the story of this episode is a two-parter. In the first part, Gamu and Fujimiya's disagreeing opinions end up forcing them to fight as Ultraman to settle the dispute. In episode 26, the second part of the story, we begin with a scene that carries on from where it left off. The music here and the soundtracks reflect on the situation, with the dialogue and the emotions giving us an idea that the battle was more than just a fight between two Ultramans, such as why was there fighting in the first place, and who was the anomaly that was waiting for the fighting to conclude. After the dramatic finish, we are then shown moments of character growth, such as Gamu questioning why Ultraman had to fight, and Fujimiya wanting to carry on with the fight. In between these moments, the fighting team that was deployed to deal with the wormholes and the anomalies encounter the biggest threat that they have come across, and then discuss a plan to attack. Throughout these moments, the sound techniques don't differ too much from the previous techniques in the other episodes that were discussed. However, leading up to this moment is where the real emphasis and the hype begins. Gamu and Fujimiya, seeing that Crisis, a program developed by Fujimiya, had fallen off the script and begun correlating with the destruction harbinger that had appeared through the wormhole, began to set aside their differences as Fujimiya realizes that his whole program had betrayed him, and his journey that he took was meaningless. So after being betrayed, Fujimiya gives up his power of being Agul and passes it on to Gamu. And from here, the biggest hype of the episode, with the backing of one of the most iconic musical soundtracks of Heisei Ultraman, begins to play. The This is a classic technique called the leitmotif. It is a recurrent theme throughout a musical or literary composition associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. In this case, it is a musical soundtrack that is repeated when it is associated with Ultraman Gaia, or known as Photon Stream, in Volume 3, Track 28 in the soundtrack album. The interesting idea with Photon Stream is that the soundtrack differs from the previous leitmotif of Gaia. In Volume 1, Track 22, titled Quantum Stream Reversal, you'll notice that the voice of the opera singer is missing. The opera singer was usually associated with the leitmotif of Agul, as Agul's personality was initially mysterious, and his introduction in the show had his identity hidden from Gaia, so the leitmotif of Agul reflected his personality. But now in this new scene, where Gamu takes the power of Agul to become Gaia V2, the musical soundtrack then combines the leitmotif of Gaia with the leitmotif of Agul. However, the leitmotif is still majority reflected as Gaia. Agul's leitmotif only complements the leitmotif of Gaia, and it doesn't drown out the leitmotif of Gaia. This could be a reflection that Gamu is receiving the energy from Agul, which becomes complementary to the first leitmotif and symbolizes a new transfer of power between the two Ultramans, with Gaia being the main Ultraman that takes on the complementary power from Agul, which is then reflected by the musical soundtrack by having Agul's leitmotif being complementary to Gaia's, and the combination of Quantum Stream Reversal and Agul's advent is combined into one soundtrack, which reflects back to the scene of the introduction of Gaia's new identity. After this introduction to a new form of Gaia, there is another form that symbolizes something new, the Gaia Supreme version. The interesting thing about this scene is that it uses the ending theme song of the first 26 episodes of the show. It had me wondering why it didn't use the Photon Stream soundtrack again for this introduction. Instead, it was used after when Gaia defeats the monster. So the use of the ending theme in a leitmotif form felt like there needed to be a reason, since the ending theme song is played usually at the end of the episode, and its purpose is so that it is an ending theme to close off and conclude the story for the episode. The fact that it was used as the leitmotif for Gaia Supreme could then mean that it was a metaphor for conclusion, or a potential symbolism for the conclusion of the first 26 episodes of Ultraman Gaia. Episode 26 was the climax, and the dramatic plot twist that had been built up since the first episode. The whole tone of the episode felt like one big conclusion, and when Gaia receives the power from Agul, which introduces Gaia's brand new forms, it would have been fitting to use the closing theme song to add to the effect that the new forms symbolizes the conclusion to the story of the conflicts of the first 26 episodes. But even though the usage of the closing theme song was used to represent a conclusion, there were still many aspects that felt new. The obvious one was the fact that Gaia had been introduced two new forms, V2 and Supreme, and also, during the credits where the actual end to the story began, we are given an obvious hint that the first half had been concluded, but the second half was about to begin, while having the ending theme song play in the background. So with the leitmotif of the ending theme song, it was used to represent an end to the first story, but also a beginning to a new story, a usage of the leitmotif that is used to also symbolize the end and the introduction of a brand new direction of the story. It's an interesting way of being able to complement the story by being able to tell the themes by the usage of music. Without this usage of the soundtrack, the emphasis of the scenes would have felt bland, but the genius way of being able to conclude and introduce a story with music is something that will be one of the greatest ways to tell a story through sounds, especially with the way the music was timed with the visuals of what was happening, and by far it will remain as one of the most iconic introductions, in my opinion, for the Ultraman franchise. These episodes that I have chosen for Ultraman Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia are only one of many episodes that bring out the creativity and the techniques that were used in musical soundtracks that emphasize the importance that it plays in enhancing the scenes in these shows. Some examples I haven't mentioned is Ultraman Tiga's main battle theme. It reserves a memory in my mind, as it makes me reminisce the episode that it once played in specific scenes. However, how these were used also played a part in developing the story. According to some words quotes from the directors and writers of these shows, it is stated that they had an understanding for when to use music to their advantage, such as from Kyoto Kawasaki, a director who had directed many of the Ultraman shows in the Heisei period, was said to have methods of directing that influenced the story, such as having one method that Kyoto Kawasaki has established as the use of music, for lack of a better term, deception through music. Music is an important element in dramatic transitions. Kawasaki even calculated the number of phrases in a song from which the cut would change. This also influenced other writers to use music as an effect to enhance the story, such as from this excerpt: "The theme by V6 is far from the image of a hero song, so at first I only had the impression that it was a tie-up song that had nothing to do with the content of the drama, but gradually the lyrics became more and more relevant to the drama, which is a coincidence that it so happens to work well within the context of the show, and the way they used it and timed it perfectly to match with the story further emphasizes the effort that is put into these shows, and using the theme song in episode 50 worked out well with the symbolisms that was portrayed." Also, a word from one of the composers of the series, from Toshihiko Sahashi, the main composer for Gaia, who also did some compositions for Dyna, states that Ultraman is something that is very natural to me. What I was most conscious of in Gaia was the Ultraman sound. The world that Kunio Miyoshi and Toru Fuyuki have is positive and optimistic. I wanted to inherit that. I always think about that when I'm working on an Ultraman project. I received a lot from Ultraman, so I want to pass that on to the children of today, and I wanted to be able to tell them there's something so great out there in a new way. It was a generation of Ultraman that was made by the generation who had grown up with the originals. It was also an era that revived the franchise from the 15-year hiatus. Many people who worked behind the scenes were people who understood what Ultraman was in the past and wanted to incorporate their love for Ultraman into a new generation of fans. So without the passion and the thoughts behind wanting to establish an era for Ultraman, this Heisei trilogy wouldn't be as iconic as it would be. As it's stated from Sahashi, the Heisei Ultraman is from a different era than now, so it was made by people who grew up watching the original Ultraman, who have a stronger attachment to the Ultraman color of the original than the Ultraman of today. However, to answer the question on why the soundtrack for these shows are iconic, it's because of, in my opinion, three things: the way it was written, the way it was used, and how it complemented the show. As discussed, the way the soundtracks were used was done in a way that provided more than just a backing track of music. It helped to develop the story, such as with Tiga, having themes of symbolisms and a soundtrack that provided an emphasis on the situation, as well as providing ideas of love and understanding between two characters, which is not only limited to the way it's used, but also when it was used, especially with Dyna, how the moments that used soundtracks and sound techniques had helped to create a scene in the show, with the music elevating the dramaticness of the scene, such as when the monster attacks, but also when it had moments that relied on the diegetic sounds of the scene, which worked really well with moments that focused on character. But regardless of the way the soundtracks for the two shows were used, it also had soundtracks that were memorable, especially with Gaia. The leitmotif of Gaia is the one that brings memories and associates itself with the character, especially when the moment is needed for introducing Gaia into the story. The leitmotif elevates the moment, letting us know that this character is one that is powerful and one that is extremely heroic. The soundtracks provides great emphasis on the shows. Without it, there wouldn't be anything else that would make us reminisce on what makes us become fans of the series, apart from seeing the visuals, which is one thing to mention. One can like the design of something from a visual point of view, but to have an association of something else, such as music or sounds, from a second point of view, would make us relate to the design of something with the music that it is associated with. In other words, without the music in the three shows, we can only relate with only seeing things visually, such as the designs of Ultraman Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia, although they are visually distinguishable and can reminisce on the designs. But having the soundtracks be associated with either Tiga, Dyna, or Gaia would help to emphasize our indulgence for the three shows. We can look at Tiga and we are reminded of the battle theme in one episode. We can look at Dyna and are reminded of the music from Strong Type, and we can look at Gaia and are reminded of Photon Stream. Without the soundtracks, what else would we associate the shows with other than the visuals? The music played a big part in emphasizing the greatness of these shows and helped to provide symbolisms in telling the story. And that's why I believe the soundtracks for Ultraman Tiga, Dyna, and Gaia are iconic. Without the soundtracks, it wouldn't just be the same. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I suggest reading Theories of the Soundtrack by James Bueller, as it helped me with ideas for how I wanted to express my thoughts on this video. And I also suggest reading Earth as Ultraman's Planet Tiga edition and Dyna and Gaia edition, as it provided some context as to how and what the thought process of making the shows were. I will leave a link in the description below if you want to check it out. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see ya. Bye.